Oh, all right. It's never spoken that before. Great. My name is Caitlin, and I work at Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. While everybody kind of settles in, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, talk about some other events that we have coming up. All right, here we go. So this Thursday, May 27th at 5:30 p.m. Central Time, Monica West is going to be in conversation with Kiese Lehman for her debut novel, Revival Season. And Paget calls this book Tender and Wise, and it tells the story of a daughter of one of the South's most famous Baptist preachers who goes on to discover a shocking secret about her father that puts her at odds with both her faith and her family. It's really powerful debut, and we're so excited for it. So that's Thursday. Then next Wednesday, June 2nd at 5:30, we have a Tasmanian author and honorary Oxonian, Richard Flanagan, is going to join us on Zoom for his newest novel, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams. It's a wrenching novel of family, climate change, and resilience of the human spirit. So I think a lot of the folks who are joining us this evening would also probably be interested in this kind of the sister climate novel. So again, that's Wednesday, June 2nd at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, or Central Daylight Time. Last one, the Tuesday following that, June 8th at 6 p.m. Central Time, we'll have Paul Mendez. He'll be joined in conversation by Maza Mengiste for Paul's just devastating, wonderful debut novel, Rainbow Milk. It's a bold reckoning with race, class, sexuality, and freedom, and religion across generations, time, and cultures. Marlon James calls it the kind of novel you never knew that you were waiting for. But enough about them. Let's talk about Jim and Marie-Helene. Jim Shepard is the author of 7 previous novels, most recently The Book of Aaron, winner of the 2016 PEN New England Award, the Sophie Brody Medal for Achievement in Jewish Literature, the Ribolo Prize for Jewish Literature, the Clark Fiction Prize, and a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He also visited Square Books in person for that book, and it was just wonderful. Glad to have you back, Jim. He's also the author of 5 short story collections, including Like You'd Understand Anyway, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and won the Story Prize. His short fiction has appeared in, among other magazines, The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, McSweeney's, The Paris Review, The Atlantic, Esquire, Tin House, Granta, Zoetrope, Electric Literature, and Vice, and has often been selected for the Best American Short Stories in the PEN/O. Henry Prize Stories. He lives in Williamstown, Massachusetts with his wife, 3 children, and 3 beagles, and he teaches at Williams College. Marie-Helene Bertino is the author of the novels Parakeet, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and 2 a.m. at the Cat's Pajamas, NPR Best Book of 2014, and also the very first advanced reader copy that I ever read as a bookseller. Her work has received the O. Henry Prize, the Pushcart Prize, and the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Fellowship in Cork, Ireland. She teaches in the MFA programs at NYU in the New School. Her 4th book, the novel Beautyland, is forthcoming from FSG. Phew, 2 very accomplished folks joining us this evening to talk about this wonderful and eerily prescient new novel, Phase 6. I'm gonna go away. Y'all please submit questions in the Q&A, and I will come back to kind of feed those to Jim and Marie-Helene. Thank y'all both so much, and so glad y'all could join us.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Great to see you.
Hi, Jim. It's so nice to see you. How is the family? How are the dogs? How's Karen?
Everybody seems to be doing very well. Are you in the bathroom? It looks like there's a shower curtain behind you. What am I looking at there?
Yes, I do all of my interviews in the bathroom. It's where I feel like I get the most light and I just feel most at home.
I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I think it's a very intimate and domestic scene, and I love seeing it that way. It's great.
Oh, thank you. It strikes me as Caitlin was reading my bio that everything she listed that I have done was made possible because you pulled my first book, the collection Safest Houses, out of the slush pile and chose it to win the University of Iowa Award. And I owe every single thing after that to you. That's not even an exaggeration. So everything she listed was made possible because of you.
Everything she listed came out of your wonderful talent and your wonderful abilities, essentially. And I still remember coming across those stories and thinking, who is this person? I want to know this person. I want to figure out how their mind works.
And then we met and you were like, I want to know less about this person. No more of this person, please.
Yeah, let's go
back. Congratulations on phase.
Thank you.
Congratulations on phase 6. As I was mentioning to you earlier, I thought I would just read the first few pages a couple days ago. And then I just have spent the last 2 days just absolutely engrossed reading it from cover to cover. It's such a beautiful book. Oh, well done.
Thank you so much.
And you're going to read from it to start us off, right?
I'll read a little bit from the beginning, whether people like it or not, and that'll start us off, and then we'll have something to talk about. How's that? What I'll do is read from the very beginning and skip around a little bit. So if you detect any gaps, you should imagine them filled with the kind of prose you prefer, Marie. But this is how the novel begins. Anyway, I'll read for about 5 minutes, I think. It had gotten colder overnight, and the grave diggers had had to use a pneumatic drill. Alec had had to listen to it all morning. The Lang family all stood off to one side of the shallow hole with the coffin in it, while their kids played around the graves. Malik asked without looking up if Alec wanted to join the club, called Everyone Hates Alec, and Alec watched 2 3-year-olds down the hill piss on the same spot in the snow and said he was already a member. Some of the grave sites had little white fences around them, and some were just white crosses among the rocks. Some of the graves had seashells on them, and some had plastic flowers or wreaths. While the minister talked, Alec and Malik scrolled through pictures of other people's pets and vacations. By the time the minister finished, it was sleeting. So when the service was over, a lot of people headed back to their houses, and the family almost had to fill in the grave alone. When Alec looked back, the wind was blowing even the frozen dirt off their shovels. When he looked back again, halfway down the hill, they'd finished with the dirt and had rolled all of the large stones on top and were posing for their photographs with their hoods up. An older kid named Tavik was ahead of them heading down the hill. Want to see the most stupid expression in Greenland, Malik asked him. When the kid looked up, Malik pointed at Alec. Some 15 years earlier, the government of Greenland had announced that it had approved 4 times the number of mining exploration licenses granted in the previous decade. An Australian company had already begun zinc and lead mines on the northern coast, and 56 other active licenses were granted for gold, rubies, nickel, copper, and rare earth minerals, including neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. The mines were promoted as contributing to the green economy, since 80% of the rare earth deposits would be used in wind turbines, hybrid cars, and lasers. So the pitch became global warming in Greenland. We are part of the solution. Instead of publicizing a lot of moping and moaning Inuits trooping off international conferences to lament the destruction of their fishing grounds, why not focus on the resources that native geologists were discovering every day under the vanishing ice sheets? Either you sat and reacted to what was hurtling towards you, or you worked to get a hold of whatever opportunity brought along. Every settlement council had its visionaries who could anticipate hundreds of generated jobs and accompanying new airports and roads and hotels. When it was pointed out that 90% of the world's rare earth minerals came from China, and that the environmental degradation that those mines had left behind was stunning, the glass half empty types were refuted with the, hold on one second. I love Zoom. Don't you love Zoom? The glass empty types were refuted with the reminder that the goal of self-sufficiency had to trump the notion of a continent changed beyond recognition, and were further chided that they couldn't live in a museum, and that the country was so huge, how could a few minds make a difference? Malik had liked what he'd seen of the new mining camp. 3 cargo containers with doors that he and Alec guessed were offices, and 2 tents on the bare rock around a big hole dug in the permafrost, with one of those sectional chain link fences that anyone could slide under. They visited the camp the next 4 nights, and on that 4th night, back on the dirt pile, Alec showed Malik a rock he'd unearthed with some digging that was glassy smooth on one side from the polish Ice Age glaciers had given it 11,000 years earlier. But what had also caught Alec's attention was a cavity where the surface had been spalled off, a scar of fractured crystals of feldspar and hornblende and ancient ice. Alec had been taken with the contrasting textures and had brought his friend's palm over to experience the difference between polish and edge. 2 days earlier, the drill bit's relentless pounding on the rock had finally broken the chemical bonds holding it to its ledge. And when that seam had cracked and the stress boundaries had separated, a cluster of molecules that had previously thrived in the respiratory tract of an early variant of the Bering goose, and that had been trapped with some throat tissue in the crystalline framework during the Holocene glaciation, had been reintroduced to the air and the warming sun. Leaving lying there in the darkness and dirt, Alec could smell them like heated metal. He had Malik smell too, those molecules that were now released to become a part of something new. The next day, they both had sore throats and made fun of how much their noses were running. It rained so much, you could hear the runoff on the road from inside the house. They went down to the water near the old halibut factory and sat in their favorite spot on one of the cement wharves built into the rock. Near where the cable for the hand winch for dragging boats or whales up onto the ramp ran into the water, a dead dog floated under the ice. Alec wiped his nose with his sleeve and then wiped Malik's. Around lunchtime, they walked back to the supermarket in the middle of the settlement and sat on the big flat rocks where the brook became a waterfall into the harbor. And some of the mine workers showed up and sat next to them and started eating and drinking. The wind off the water helped with the mosquitoes. 3 of the mine workers were white and 1 was dark-skinned. The foreman recognized Alec and nodded at him, and Alec and Malik were close enough to hear their talk. Some were speaking Danish and some something else. The foreman seemed interested in teasing him and kept running his hands through his own hair, so Malik pretended to be thrilled and told him, "You're so tall and handsome," and then was happy when the foreman and 2 of the men laughed. And then the dark-skinned worker showed them a funny video he'd taken of one of his drunk white friends falling down a flight of stairs, and the mine workers talked about getting to go home the next day. They were happy about it. Then the dark-skinned worker and Malik showed each other their phones. And the mine workers shared some Danish bread they had bought at the supermarket and some snow crab they had gotten at the tourist restaurant. Everyone loved the snow crab and there was a lot of it, so it was passed around. And in that way, their shared fork became a fomite, from the Latin fomites, for tinder or fire starter, an object that when contaminated with an infectious agent will transfer that agent to the new host. I'll stop there. As you might guess, things go downhill from there, Marie.
Hilarity ensues from that fomite.
Exactly.
Thanks for reading that, Jim. That's the beginning of phase 6. And just from there, it just never really lets you go. So I'm so glad you read from the beginning. I know that a lot of people talk about the research that you do, but I'd like to ask you a question about what you make up instead of asking about the research first, if you don't mind. Because I'm intuiting after reading the novel that you wrote the novel before COVID-19, and then the world conspired to give you essentially 1.5 years of just one big fact check for the novel that you had just written. And so I imagine you found yourself in the exceptional position of literally being able to live inside the novel you had just written, which means you had the rare, I swear this is the longest question I have. You had the rare opportunity to supplement and compare research with lived experience after the fact. So this is what I'm wondering. What were you surprised about, if anything, that you got right from the research? And was there anything like a detail or something that you only found out about the pandemic because you had the lived experience, like a detail that you never could have found in your research?
A very good question, and very brief as well, Marie. So, I think what the biggest surprise for me was, although I had thought I was bottomlessly cynical enough about how our political entities would respond, what I imagined was the way in which individual political entities like governors would screw up things like the quarantining of their states and things like that. It hadn't fully occurred to me that there would be an entire political party devoted to becoming the virus's ally, essentially. It also hadn't occurred to me, even though I thought I was quite far down that road of understanding how much Americans want to be lied to. I wasn't ready quite for the level of denial that immediately started metastasizing across American culture. So I guess the bottom line was the science part of it, there weren't that many surprises, partially because I've been talking to so many microbiologists and so many CDC people and stuff like that. The political side of it surprised me to some extent. And I, again, had thought that I was out in front of that, but I think because I wasn't imagining a psychotic satiric farce, I wasn't really ready for some of the ways in which things started to ramify in that way. So that probably was the biggest surprise. In terms of invention, the first part of your question, it did seem to me very much as though the kind of pandemic that would be most likely would be the kind we had with COVID. And that is either something zoonotic, something that jumped from an animal, a close species, or something that walked out of a lab. And we aren't sure at this point which it is. It's turning out, as you probably know, that the walking out of a lab thing is not as unlikely as people thought it was earlier on. As we discover that we can't find viruses that are close enough to this to suggest that they were the stepping stones. So what I was trying to do that I knew was slightly rare option was to come up with the kind of pathogen that would be actually very hard for a global scientific community to figure out what they were dealing with. Because I just thought that would be more fun to read. And I always thought that was the cool, that was the sort of cool thing where not only are you in the presence of something lethal, but you have all these very smart people going, what on earth am I looking at? And that just seemed to me more narratively cool than, oh, we know exactly what it is. When are we going to get a vaccine, right? And so I essentially dumped that problem into, as I often do, when I needed to invent something, I dumped that problem into smarter people's laps. And I went to, especially the microbiologist that I'd been working with the most closely, and said, here's what I want. I want something that you simply can't identify for these reasons. How would that work? And what's great is watching science people who are every bit as nerdy as we are, go, what would be super cool if there was something that, and there are models for this, right? There are things like Legionnaire's disease that completely buffaloed the entire scientific establishment. Like, what are we dealing with here? And that's what I wanted. I wanted to do something that would be even more terrifying because it couldn't be identified for so long. And I just wanted to make sure that there was a scientific basis for that, so that when people who had more knowledge of the subject read it, they didn't just throw the book across the room, right? They sort of said, oh, this is kind of cool, right? So that kind of invention, I think, is part of why I'm a fiction writer and not a nonfiction writer, because that I get to do. And that kind of thing, if you're a nonfiction writer, just seems annoying, right? It's like, wouldn't it be cool? Or wouldn't it be, and it's like, could you just report on what's actually happening, please? That kind of thing.
And then narratively, it's so wonderful because we, the reader, know exactly where the pandemic comes from. And so narratively, the question becomes, when are the scientists going to figure out? And that starts a clock. And so the mystery just pulls you, like I said, it just doesn't let you go, because you feel so sorry for these scientists, because you know more than they do the entire time. Look in the permafrost, you just want to scream. So narratively, it's more interesting to do it that way too, as obviously you knew from the beginning.
And I really love too that sort of worm's eye view, where you're either the person who's at ground zero in terms of the outbreak, or you're the grunt who's in the lab trying to figure this out. One of the few areas of the experience of the pandemic that the book relatively neglects is, what is it like to be running the CDC when this happens, right? Those sort of big political questions. Because I'm just not that interested in, what you might call leadership studies. I'm much more interested in the poor schmoes who have to deal with the ramifications of what the leaders come up with, because I think that's most of us. It's certainly my experience. So I knew when I was designing the book, well, I need to have somebody who's just a hapless patient. And of course, as you know, with my stuff, whenever I'm in a bind, I just drag a kid into it. I knew that there'd be a child at the heart of this somewhere. And then I also thought, well, I need the epidemiologists. I need the people who are actually doing the research. And then I thought I need a medical person. I need somebody who can essentially track what's happening to the human body when this is going on as well. Because as you say, one of the nice narrative setups that are involved in this kind of design is we know something that the characters don't. And I've always loved mysteries like that, right? Where you're like, just look under the sofa, my God, that kind of thing. My mother used to just shout at the screen, that kind of thing. That's a really powerful pleasure. And there's also, I'm just not perverse enough to have only worm's eye views where nobody knows what's going on, right? That's because the reader just needs to know too much. So it became very clear that I needed a very mobile point of view, first of all. It also became clear that there were any number of areas that I was hopelessly poorly educated about and was going to have to educate myself about. And that meant years of reading, essentially. But it also meant, happily, that I only needed to come up with the illusion of knowing what I was talking about. I didn't really need to know what I was talking about.
And then, the past year and a half has made us all kind of experts on pandemics. So while you've been writing and going through the publishing process, your readership has elevated in its understanding and knowledge of what you were already studying. And I wonder how that, I know you're at the beginning of your book tour, but I wonder how that's going to affect, I guess, most directly your Q&As.
Well, more than the Q&As, going back to your earlier question, where there was, you're saying, what is it like revising a book in that sort of situation? Part of what we all know as fiction writers is when it comes to exposition, we explain what people don't know and we don't bother to explain what everybody knows. And that meant that I was writing a book at a time when nobody knew anything about any of this stuff, right? So I was putting all of this exposition in that as I was going through the year of editing it, I was like, everybody knows this now. Everybody knows this now. Everybody knows this now. And so my books, which always tend to be fairly slim to begin with, were just getting slimmer and slimmer as I was dumping exposition, essentially, because I no longer needed to describe, why, wearing a mask was an important thing, right? Mm-hmm. Which when I began was a radical idea. I was talking to people when I was first beginning the book, and I was saying, everybody would be going around with masks, and people were like, come on, what are you saying? Like you would go outside and everybody would be wearing a mask? And I'm like, that's what I'm saying, right?
Wow.
Or the precipitous speed with which you go from airports looking like the fall of Saigon, mm-hmm. the airports being empty, right? Mm-hmm. Just the surreal visual of that. You sort of imagine that, and then you have to explain how all of that would happen. And then you dump all that explanation because everybody's been through it, right? Everybody knows it, right? So you just make a reference to it at that point. And even in that, I probably didn't dump enough. I probably could have dumped more. But that, I often feel that way. I often feel like I could always dump more than I'm dumping,
I think that's why you're a good editor.
it's part of it. And part of it is I'm always aware that the technical has to give way before the visceral. And the exposition always has to give way before emotion. And so, you know, it's so hard as a fiction writer, as you know, you learn all this great shit and you think, I'm putting it in. You know, I put these hours in. This is a great detail. It's going in the book, right? And for that reason, there are a lot of people who write big, baggy novels because they can just dump everything in there. And I think a lot of readers, you know, find that appealing. I don't. And I also don't find detail for the sake of detail very appealing. And so it's routine. That stuff that I labored to get right and think is pretty wonderful. I'm thinking, oh, that's not staying in because it's doing the same work emotionally that some other detail did. And for me, pace is always the most important thing. I really don't want to slow down the pace if I can avoid it.
Oh man, I'm learning just listening to you. This is why I don't do any research though. Like, it's very kind of you to say, as you know, you want to put all the things you've learned into your novel. I don't learn anything that new. Because I write about, you know, super weird stuff that I like fully invent, and I just don't explain any of it. I get around it that way. But speaking of the poor schmoes that you did find and throw against this supremely challenging and exceptional backdrop, I want to ask you two different questions, and I'm trying to think of which one to start with. I'm sure you've probably gotten the first one a lot, but what is it with you and kids? Why do you hate kids so much?
I think what it is I'm always moved by the basic dilemma kids face of needing to articulate something as sophisticated as their perceptions with something as limited as their vocabularies. You know, Henry James has a great insight in the introduction to What Maisie Knew, where he talks about the fact that children have many more perceptions than they have vocabulary to give those perceptions form. And I remember so vividly as a kid feeling like I didn't have the words for what I was feeling, but what I was feeling was really complicated and really intense. And that, you know, of course, echoes the dilemma of the writer, right? We all feel that way when we write. I don't know, how do we put this, right? So that helplessness and that striving has always been very moving to me. I also am always interested thematically in, I guess what I would call responsibility without power. And that's also a position children are often in. You know, I need you to be a good boy and you don't have any power and things are just going to happen to you essentially. And that pathos has always meant a lot to me as well. So I've written about children my whole career, and I probably won't stop. Mostly, but as you say, it's mostly a hatred for kids. That's really
That's very clear.
Yeah.
That comes through loud and clear. And then the other two poor schmoes. So then we have this like beautiful female friendship that I totally loved. And it between Janine and, I actually have not heard this word said out loud. Do you pronounce her name Denise?
Yeah, I do, Denise.
Okay, great. So Denise and Janine, who are the ones tasked with figuring out where this came from. But they have this like beautiful friendship between them that is also, I feel like, the emotional heartbeat of the novel besides Alec. And so like, how did you, I know you said you wanted a doctor and you needed them to fulfill certain roles, but how did you find, you know, the flesh to build around that skeleton?
You know, I love the idea of, you know, when I was talking to CDC people and researching it, they were talking about the fact that very often they would just be dumped into the deep end of the pool before they felt like they were ready. And they were very often not trusted by the places they were going. They were very often completely on their own. They were very often looked down upon in a lot of ways. And I thought, what must it be like for the women in these positions, right? And especially women of color. And so the idea that there would be two women paired, because usually the CDC will send in a pair of epidemiologists. And the idea that there would be two women paired intrigued me. I like that idea a lot. And in terms of what they would have to put up with. And then I also very much like the way, you know, people in that profession talk about how much they have neglected almost every other aspect of their life to get to this point in their careers, essentially. And of course, it feels to them like a decision they're not entirely sure was the right decision. And of course, it feels to them as well like not just a choice, but an incapacity, right? Like maybe the reason I'm such a workaholic is that I'm not good with people, right? And so then I thought, well, what happens if you get two women like that together, right? Who are fairly convinced that they alone are really inept around people. They've had pretty disastrous, relationship histories and blah, blah, blah. Then the way they hit it off with each other started to feel to me very moving. And the way they depend on each other, especially as they each feel like, one of the other things that interested me about the situation I'd set up is as soon as you say you can't even identify what you're dealing with. When you're in the scientific community, on the one hand, that's quite exciting, but on the other hand, you think you have this horrible sense, suppose I'm missing something incredibly basic. And that sense that you're about to be the buffoon that everybody's like, I cannot believe that Jim didn't notice this, right? Is a totally terrifying notion. And it haunts you as you continue to work. And the idea that you would have this one person who has your back, who's able to go, no, you're not losing your mind, right? You've double checked everything and you don't have the answer yet. That also seemed really interesting to me and compelling. Because of course, as you know, with this kind of thing too, as you set up this whole apparatus of the macro story, you're thinking, well, what's powering it on the micro level? What are the emotional stories that are in some ways at least as important to the reader, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I just want to remind anyone that if you have a question, you can drop it into the Q&A or the chat, and Caitlin will be fielding that. And speaking of Janine and Denise, toward about 3/4 of the way, a little farther than 3/4 of the way through the novel, there is a chapter. By the way, I love these shorter sections with the cool titles. That's like my fave. There's a section, and I just wrote science, and Janine with an exclamation point, and Janine and Denise are on the phone trying to solve it. And it's so fast paced, and they're still like acknowledging themselves as human beings. You need to eat something. I got a power bar. And they're hanging up, they're walking to the window and staring out, they're calling each other back. And it's actually kind of filmic and so exciting. And that's, when they, get as close as they can to figuring it out. And that I just, there's no question. I just loved that.
Oh God, I love that kind of comment where people go, it's not a question, I just like something.
It's great. So
that actually, here's a bit of inside information. That actually mimics an excited conversation that I had with the microbiologist I was working with, where we just kept firing things back and forth. And it was like, well, suppose, and then, yeah, but then it's also, and so that same excitement of being able to start to figure something out. Yeah. And of course, I was the slow child in the class in that case, right? Because she's teaching me as we're going along. But then I'm sort of going, but if that's true, then could we do this? That kind of thing. That excitement, I was also trying to, you try to move the revelations of science into the realm of something that a layperson can find not only comprehensible, but also kind of cool, right? Kind of fun, as opposed to, well, I don't know what that equation means, whatever.
Right. And there's something about two people who are really good at what they do, like the absolute top, figuring something out together. So it reminded me, I related to it like, writers talking to other writers and being like really excited about something that probably only writers would be. Some like small little craft-based thing that they figured out about a comma, for example. And being able to spend hours talking about that, it just got that feeling exactly right. Let alone that the entire world depended on their conversation. And quite frankly, that's kind of radical in a novel, that the entire world, the life and death of the world depended on two women talking.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I also, as an English person, I was like, wouldn't that be great if the whole world depended on two people doing dialogue?
And it worked.
It worked. You know, I like your writer's analogy, because the analogy that I was thinking of is a related one. I was thinking of not so much two writers arguing over a comma, but the way writers in a writer's room can get really excited, right? So that, you know, if Bill Hader and John Mulaney are working on a sketch for SNL, you know, one of them, well, what about this? What about that? You know, and that's very much the way the two epidemiologists are going at the end, when they're suddenly realizing, I think I'm starting to figure this out, you know?
Which is interesting you mentioned that, because I actually watch a lot of comedians interviewing each other, and I just watched John Mulaney interview Bill Hader on stage.
There you go.
And it was the absolute, and it was like two people at the top of their craft just talking. I don't think they talked about the project that they were there to talk about once. And it was like a masterclass in comedy. It was beautiful. Do you watch a lot of comedians too? I know.
I do. My kids are huge comic fans, and so am I. And so we're always hunting for new comedians. And I think I've seen that interview you were talking about. And one of the things that's so appealing about that sort of thing, besides the fact that they're two of the funnier people on the planet, is just the level of appreciation that you can feel, you know. And that was something I was trying to get to, right? Is that, you know, you're talking about the friendship between the women, that exchange you have, you know, when Jim and Marie are like, God, I'm just happy to be around your mind, you know, is really, really a blessing. It's really something that you don't get all the time. And so in the middle of all of this agony, in the middle of all of this pressure, they're able to go, God, I'm just so glad that I got to watch you in action, you know. And you can really feel that with Hader and Mulaney, you know, they're just so happy that they've been able to bounce ideas off each other, you know.
Yep. Yep. And in like just the minutia of what they're talking about, because they also, I think there are 3 times where they just go into this riff where they essentially start writing together on that stage as if the audience wasn't there. And I'm like, this is so cool that we get to listen to this.
Right. Yeah. That fly on the wall thing is just very, very cool.
It really is. So I know pretty soon the audience is going to come in. So I want to ask this one question before we let them. Do you mind if I read a paragraph?
I would be delighted. I have just enough narcissism to want to hear my own work.
Good. That's what I was counting on. So Alec, the little boy, is thinking about his grandfather. Speaking of a craft question, this is the stuff I really love, and this is what I read for. He's thinking about his grandfather. His grandfather liked gooseberry jelly on sliced bread, and whenever he shared anything with Alec, he always said after the first bite, "It's good, isn't it?" He always had to have his dogs nearby and said it was so he could hear what they were talking about. His answer to every question was maybe. He never liked how impatient Alec got when they were baiting hooks for the long lines, since first you had to clear off the hooks that still had the old rotten bait on them. He still used lichen as an insulating layer in the bottom of his boots. He did all his cleaning before Christmas with buckets of melted ice. He used his teeth to pull his knots tight. So I could ask my students for the rest of time to notice details, and like a character is what they notice, but you can't really teach how to notice what you're noticing in that way. And since I have, been lucky enough to hang out with you, I know that you're a listener. Like, I know that you actually listen to people. You have that very rare quality. But I think you can listen to people your whole life and still not know which details to use in a paragraph like that in enviably few strokes to develop a grandfather, in this case, in absentia. Mm-hmm. So my question is, were you always a noticer? Do you collect these details in a copybook? What is your relationship to this small?
I was always a noticer, and like a lot of writers, I was one of those people who was quiet in the corner of the room and paying attention. And also, like a lot of writers, I had a big, noisy, entertaining family that was very good at creating a lot of material. I do collect stuff exactly the way you described, the way most writers do, but I don't do it when I'm not working on something, weirdly. Like if I'm not sort of going, another detail that I'll use somewhere someday. I trust that I'm going to remember that in that case. But I do know writers that do that all the time. Amy Hempel once, in a conversation when we were all just standing around, I said something that she thought was funny, and she said, "I got dibs on that. You don't get to use it." So there are people who are collecting all the time. I'm only collecting when I'm working on something. On the other hand, I'm always trying to be working on something. Mm-hmm. And that, you know, that selection process is always about the kind of training that I think we've had as family members and people in relationships that mean a lot to us and to begin with, right? Because there's that quality of the way Marie shut the door is very different than the way Marie shut it yesterday. And I've noticed that, right? And there's also the way when we talk to one another and we, you know, somebody says, "So what was your mother like?" And you go, "You want to know what my mother was like?" And you have that detail already, right? You don't give her 1,000 details. My mother was the kind of woman who, and you give that detail that you know in some ways is way more eloquent than some of the other more banal details. And that's come from a sort of a hard-earned sort of developmental stage where you sort of go, I understand that if I'm watching closely enough, I'm going to be rewarded. I'm either going to avoid conflict, or I'm going to be able to mediate, or I'm going to be, you know, all these things that you do in that kind of family situation that teaches you the importance of paying attention. I did essentially as a little kid. And so it's just a talent or an ability that I've continued to try to work on. And now Caitlin has lost patience with us finally.
No, not at all.
Caitlin is like, "This has got to stop now."
Incorrect. Couldn't be more wrong.
Okay.
I was trying to think of like an eloquent way that wasn't just me being like, "I love that question. I love that answer." Because I do. I wrote the question down because I want to ask more authors that same question. It's a very good one. So I'm sorry to cut you off. I was trying to be
No worries.
slick. You can't be slick in Zoom. Nothing subtle.
Exactly.
So we have a couple of questions, but because you mentioned that it's nice to hear just, "Hey, I like that." I'm going to start with a couple of those first, and then we'll get into the folks who actually need answers. Okay.
Hey, I hated those. Don't we?
No, they're good. They're good questions. It's all good. So Catherine, and Catherine, I'm sorry if I get your last name wrong, Lesotho, says she loves Marie's 4-color pen. I do too. And that this event is great. Thanks. And she sends hugs and kisses. Thank you, Catherine. I'm glad you're enjoying. I do too. And Liz Prado says, "Great to see your face and hear your voice, Jim." Purple heart. Same. Thank you, Liz. So I don't know. I think I don't know if authors always see those, and I feel like it's important that y'all, you know, see the little love notes too. Okay, so this first one is anonymous. It shouldn't have been. It's a good question though. So phase 6 is the highest pandemic level, but also one of your main characters explains that in a relationship, phase 6 is when you consider, maybe the problem is me. Would you talk about the meaning of the more intimate, emotional definition of phase 6 in the book, and perhaps its relation to recurring themes in your work overall? Ooh, very good.
You know, it was what I was talking about with Marie earlier, that sense we have, in this case, the sense that the two women epidemiologists have, especially, that they're continually letting each other down in emotional terms, and that they continually let all sorts of people down in emotional terms, is bound up in that moment when you know, that's Janine in the novel, having said that to a man she was involved with that she thought was a pretty wonderful man, and somehow she got prematurely down this road of describing the arc of a relationship as she understood it, and gets to that point of saying, "It's not you, it's me." And because it's premature, he's sort of like, "Really? You're running this by me now?" And she looks back on that as having been yet another example of just how club-footed or ham-handed she could be, essentially. But I'm interested in the way, and I've been interested in this my whole career, the way in which we simultaneously announce that we're blaming ourselves and try to let ourselves off the hook at the same time. And the slipperiness of that, "It's not you, it's me." You know, Seinfeld had a lot of fun with that decades ago, right? "It's not you, it's me," as a way of getting off the hook. Pretending you're bringing the responsibility on yourself when you're really not trying to do that. That always interests me, and it interests me in this book in the way that the micro matches the macro, right? As citizens, we pretend we're not responsible for our complicity and climate change and the kind of things that are creating the situations that are enabling pandemics. And individually, we do the same thing in our relationships. We pretend that our behavior has been beyond reproach, and somehow things have just gone south anyway. And so I'm interested in bringing those two together in a book like this. And I'm also interested in the way the scale, you put one up against the other and it illuminates both of them, right? I mean, in the middle of a global pandemic, you're sort of thinking, am I going to get to see Caitlin again? That would be cool, right? And you're like, where are your priorities? What are you doing? You know, that kind of thing. And that's very much the way human beings operate.
Yeah, absolutely. So this next one, and this is one that you've already kind of touched on, but
oh good, I'll just repeat myself.
Yeah, well, or elaborate, or so Laura would like to know, or first she says, thank you for this wonderful conversation. So we've already kind of spoken about pacing, but when you're editing your work, how do you decide or check for pacing? Are there techniques, or is it kind of just this innate kind of rhythm that you feel in the book?
Well, the techniques are related to the innate rhythm you feel, of course. And one of the things that I do is I read through, when I'm revising, I read through it aloud, which helps with pacing as well. And I'm also going back in chunks and reading forward. So I'm trying to read bigger sections of the book in a rapid way, as well as sort of doing the jeweler's thing where you're going line by line. And that allows you to get a sense of when things are dragging as well. But the other thing that people often forget is what we mean by pacing is not exactly, are there lots of events? It's really, what's the rate of revelation? How much are we learning? And if we're not learning enough, it feels as though the pace is lagging, even if, cars are colliding and buildings are falling over, and that doesn't affect pace as much as our sense of revelation does. So one of the other things I'm doing when I'm going back through it is I'm thinking, am I continually learning? And if I'm not learning, if the reader's not learning at this point, what on earth is the reader doing? Why do I have this here, right? And that's what I meant when I was talking to Marie earlier also about some of these details are doing the same work, right? And I have that with my students all the time, right? They'll be like, this is such a cool detail. And I go, I know, and it's exactly like that other cool detail, right? And they go, I know, but I want them both. And I know you want them both. I don't want them both, right? And this is not about you. This is about me. I'm the reader. So get rid of one of those, right? And that's a very hard thing to do. It's a version of Hemingway's Kill Your Darlings, but it's only a version of it because Hemingway's talking about his own prose. And in this case, I'm also talking about a detail that you worked really, really hard to come up with, right? I did so much research about how viruses operate, and I came up with this one thing, and I'm using it. One way or the other, I'm using it. And you're like, no, you don't get to use it. You got to get rid of it. And you realize, you think, oh, that was an hour in the library that you're just throwing away, right? And then what I say to the writer is, no, it's not. It's not thrown away. It's made you a more interesting human being. Or conversely, it's kept you off the streets. One or the other.
I love that. Okay, well, we've got time for one more, and then we can kind of wrap it up and say our goodbyes. I love this audience. Everyone is so complimentary. I'll come back anytime. I mean, well, to you, but maybe Jim, you should come back every time, both of y'all. So Mac would like to know, first he says, you're such a good short story writer, as well as such a good novelist. How do you decide which material is suited to which form? And I'll kind of like add to that. When you have an idea, like, do you just kind of put pen to paper, see what happens, and then you kind of see, or do you kind of know before you've even put the first word on the page, like this is almost certainly a short story or almost certainly a novel?
Well, going back to what I was saying about pace and wanting to move things along as quickly as possible, in a very perverse way, I'm trying to make everything as short as I can. And so almost every idea I come up with, I'm thinking, this is probably a short story, which is also, by the way, a surefire way to put less food on your children's plates. And so a lot of times what I'll be doing is years of research to do a long short story. And in fact, a writer friend of mine, Ron Hansen, once saw my research files for a story about a hereditary executioner during the French Revolution and said, "You're insane." He goes, "I could have written a trilogy with what you're going to get a short story out of this with all of this material." And I was like, yeah. And some of that is trying to do it as, you know, I really love literature that feels like a guerrilla action as opposed to a massed invasion, you know, where you get in and you get out very, very quickly. I don't like a lot of furniture moving. I don't like a lot of throat clearing. I don't like a lot of grandiosity. I like to move in and move out as fast as I can. And also with something like that, for example, I also don't, you know, because I'm trying to stretch my empathetic imagination to cover people who are not always the most pleasant people to cover, I don't want to spend 3 years with somebody who kills people for a living. You know, I'm willing to spend 6 months or 8 months writing that, but I don't want to spend 3 years with it. So that's one of the other impulses. What has happened, as was the case with the Book of Aaron, or a novel called Nosferatu, is I thought, can I really do this as a short story? Can I cover that much? And then I've had to say, no, you can't. This is going to have to be a novel. And so what makes my agent happy actually makes me sad. You know, I'm like, oh, I guess this is going to have to be a novel now. That's a long-winded answer, but it was a good job, I guess.
That's a great one. Yeah, this has been so wonderful. And something that's, I don't know if anybody cares about this, but one of the like kind of like silver linings of having these Zoom events and kind of finding different folks to be in conversation is you kind of never really know like what course the talk is going to take. And another compliment, both of y'all students are just so lucky. You know, I've been a long time out of school, and it's so wonderful to hear all the, you know, the kind of passion behind the talking craft. And I know we talked about that also with your characters as well, but it's just I don't know, I love getting to peek behind the curtain, because I do kind of think that, you know, when you're, especially a book that's kind of is like, you know, you zip right through it, you kind of forget that there's all this work behind it. And but you speak about it with so much kind of passion and joy, which, I don't know, it's just lovely and wonderful. I'm rambling, but before we wrap it up, I do want to remind folks that we have signed book plate editions, very handsome, from Knopf, and a little guilt trip. Without your support, dear attendees, we could not have such wonderful events, virtual or otherwise. So if you haven't bought the book yet, buy it from us. I will drop that link one more time, and I, you know, I try to like throw a little blurb in when I'm introducing y'all, but Jim, you had so many, I really couldn't choose. And I think that's especially kind of incredible given the subject matter, because I think a lot of folks would be like, oh, no, and run away. But don't run away. Buy the book, read it, you'll love it. So I guess I'll hand it to y'all, and then we'll say goodbye. You want to? Last words? It seems ominous, but.
Marie, it was a pleasure seeing you again and talking with you again.
The pleasure was mine, Jim.
I couldn't decide whether you were Bill Hader or John Mulaney, but either way, it was a pleasure.
I can't decide either. We'll take turns.
Okay.
I love it. Thank you both, and thanks to all of the folks who joined us this evening. Have a wonderful night, and we will see y'all next time.
And give Richard a hug for me, Caitlin.
Yes. Oh, you know, Jim, he actually had a little comment, and then we'll stop. Richard says, thanks, Jim and Marie. Wish you were here in Oxford and Square Books, and after the event, we could go out and, quote, talk of the long instancy of mankind. And he says, I can't just now remember who said that. I don't know who said it either.
Well, I wish you could do that, and not only do that, but also I'll get shit-faced together. I'm sad.
Yeah, City Grocery. It'll be here. Y'all come to see us when the world's a little more normal. We'd love to have you.
Does this mean we're honorary Oxfordians now?
Oxonians, yes. And I think like all of our visiting authors are honorary Oxonians, but I think Richard Flanagan like legitimately has a piece of paper. I don't know exactly. But yeah, we'll claim you all if you will.
I think after what Marie did tonight, she should get a piece of paper too.
All right, I'll send you a piece of paper. Okay, y'all take care. Thanks so much.
See you again.
All right, bye.
Take care.